What if the American Civil War never actually ended at Appomattox? What if it just, changed its weapons?
Right, like the battlefield just shifted.
Exactly. Shifted from open combat into the very legal and social frameworks of the country. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are thrilled you're here with us today.
We really are.
Yeah. So our mission today is to explore how deep-seated historical structures of violence manifest in modern society, and to examine the actual frameworks that global scholars use to envision lasting peace.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It is. We are unpacking the work of Dr. J.P. Linstroth, specifically focusing on his 2020 essay titled, Why Race is Everything in America. And we're pairing that with his extensive professional portfolio as a peace and conflict researcher.
But before we dive into all that material, we really need to establish a clear baseline for you, the listener, because the source material we are covering today deals with incredibly politically charged subject matter.
Very much so.
It directly addresses race, policing, systemic inequality, and some deeply painful historical events in America.
Yeah, and we want to be absolutely clear up front about this. We are not here to take sides.
Right, no sides.
We're not endorsing any specific political viewpoints or policies or social movements mentioned in these texts. Our sole goal today is to impartially convey the ideas and the research contained in Dr. Linstroth's writings.
Exactly. We just want to give you an objective, clear window into the author's perspective so you can fully understand the sociological frameworks he's using.
To really understand that framework, though, it's vital to know whose lens we are looking through, right? Like, Dr. Linstroth is not just a casual cultural commentator.
No, not at all. He holds a PhD in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Oxford.
Oxford, yeah.
He served as a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, which is, a premier global hub for conflict resolution. And he's a recipient of a Presidential Lifetime Achievement Award.
So he brings some serious weight.
Yeah, when he writes about societal conflict, he brings a heavy, globally tested academic pedigree to the table.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because he starts his essay with that massive historical claim I hinted at in the beginning. He argues that the racial conflicts we see today are the direct, unbroken lineage of the Civil War.
The unbroken lineage, yeah.
He calls this evolution structural violence. And the way I like to visualize this, think of history not as a closed book, but as the foundation of a house.
I like that analogy.
Right. Because if the foundation was poured with the cracks of Jim Crow and black codes, the house is still going to tilt today. It doesn't matter how much you paint the walls or, renovate the kitchen.
Exactly. And looking closely at how that foundation was poured really reveals the mechanics of Linstroth's argument. He traces a direct continuum starting immediately after the abolishment of slavery with the 13th Amendment.
Because there was a catch.
A massive legal loophole, yeah. It outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime.
Which, that created an immediate perverse incentive to criminalize the newly freed population.
Precisely. The system rapidly adapted to utilize that loophole. Southern states instituted black codes and vagrancy laws.
Right.
So if an African-American man could not present written proof of employment, he could be arrested for vagrancy.
Just for not having a piece of paper.
Right. And the penalty was often being leased out as forced labor to plantations or corporations through the chain gang system. The economic engine of free labor didn't disappear. It was just structurally rebranded as the criminal justice system.
Wow. And then you add sharecropping into the mix, which basically functioned as an economic trap, keeping families in perpetual debt to landowners. It essentially locked them to the very land they used to be enslaved on.
And after that came the Jim Crow laws, legally mandating segregation in every public sphere.
Yeah, Linstroth emphasizes that it took a full 100 years after the Civil War, an entire century of this evolving structural violence before the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s could even begin to restore basic constitutional rights.
Which brings us to how Linstroth connects this century-long architectural blueprint to the modern day.
Right, the 2020 events.
Yes, he argues that the tragic events of the summer of 2020 are not isolated anomalies. They aren't a sudden breakdown in social order. He views them as the tilted foundation operating exactly as it was built to operate.
He points specifically to 4 cases from that year, right, to illustrate how routine scenarios escalate to lethal outcomes for African Americans.
Yeah, the sources detail these events to show the staggering disproportion of the violence.
Like George Floyd, a 46-year-old man killed by a police officer kneeling on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. And the catalyst for this lethal encounter was just an alleged counterfeit $20 bill at a grocery store.
Right. Linstroth uses this to ask how a minor, nonviolent suspicion justifies a fatal militarized response.
And he applies the same analytical lens to Breonna Taylor.
Yes, Breonna Taylor. And an emergency medical technician shot at least 8 times in her own apartment during a botched no-knock police warrant in Louisville.
So the structural violence there is
The legal mechanism itself. The no-knock warrant, which is disproportionately utilized in minority neighborhoods, it effectively turns a residential home into a combat zone.
Yeah. And then there's Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. He literally fell asleep in his car in a Wendy's drive-thru.
Right.
And after failing a sobriety test and a subsequent scuffle where he grabbed a taser, he was shot in the back while running away. Linstroth really zeroes in on the escalation there. Like, why is the baseline response to a man sleeping in a drive-thru one that ends in lethal force?
But the most glaring example Linstroth provides of this historical continuum doesn't even involve law enforcement at all.
Oh, Ahmaud Arbery.
Yeah. He highlights the case of Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old out for a jog in a coastal Georgia neighborhood. Arbery was chased, cornered, and murdered by 2 white men, a father and son who essentially deputized themselves.
And they filmed it.
They filmed the pursuit themselves, yeah,
Yeah.
demonstrating a chilling level of entitlement and impunity.
The sources bring in a quote from Van Jones, the political activist and commentator who was speaking on CNN about the George Floyd murder. And Jones bypassed the modern terminology of police brutality entirely. He reached straight back into that historical foundation.
What did he call it?
He called it a lynching. He stated, "We saw a white man deprive a black man of his life in public with the entire community staring. There have been lynchings happening in America for hundreds of years."
And Linstroth grounds that devastating statement in hard historical data.
From the Tuskegee Institute.
Yes. They documented a staggering 3,446 lynchings of African Americans in the United States between 1882 and 1968.
Over 3,000. That's just...
It's massive. That is not ancient history. That is a sustained intergenerational campaign of public terror designed to maintain the social hierarchy.
Right.
Linstroth argues that the public nature of the George Floyd video triggered such a massive societal trauma because it was a modern digital echo of that exact same historical terror.
Wow. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the text transitions from these sweeping macro-level historical statistics to the micro level.
The everyday stuff.
Exactly. Because structural violence isn't just about what is written in the legal code or the catastrophic tragedies that make the evening news. It's about the lived, day-to-day administration of racism that quietly sustains those systemic disparities.
Linstroth shares some deeply unsettling personal anecdotes from his time as a white anthropologist to illustrate how this operates in the background.
Like the plantation tour.
Yeah, he describes experiencing what he calls the wink-wink, nod-nod culture of white privilege. About 14 years ago, he took a paid tour of a plantation in southern Georgia.
And the guide just starts saying things.
The white tour guide casually began making derogatory, racist remarks about black people. And the mechanism at play here is the assumption of complicity.
Right. The guide felt completely safe expressing overt racism. Assuming that because Linstroth was also white, he naturally shared those views. And that assumption of a shared unspoken racial hierarchy pops up again when Linstroth is a graduate student in Tallahassee, Florida.
Oh, the middle school.
Yes. He visits a middle school to talk to the kids about culture. And a white teacher pulls him aside and absurdly, overtly refers to the black students in her classroom as little monkeys.
It's horrifying.
She actually asked him, as an anthropologist, if they evolved differently. I mean, we're talking about an educator in a modern school system responsible for the intellectual development of those very children, operating with a 19th century pseudoscience mindset.
What's fascinating here is how these anecdotes build to Linstroth's most heartbreaking example of structural violence.
The Tuskegee Airmen interview.
Yes. He recounts an interview he conducted for a class on folk relations. He visits the home of a deacon from a Black Baptist church in southern Georgia, a community, by the way, that had recently seen multiple churches torched by racist violence.
All right, the stakes were high.
He sits in a darkened kitchen with an African-American man in his 80s.
And the generational contrast in this man's family tells the entire story of America.
It really does.
His grandfather was a slave, his father was a sharecropper. But this man broke the cycle. He fought in World War II as a pilot in the legendary Tuskegee Airmen Squadron.
A decorated war hero.
Exactly. And after the war, he earned a university degree from Florida A&M. So he's a decorated war hero with a college education.
Yet, Despite his service and his credentials, the only job he was ever allowed to hold in his community was as a janitor at the nearby university.
A janitor, because his blackness was a stigma.
This illustrates the true grinding mechanics of structural violence. It's not just the overt threat of a burning church, it is the quiet, bureaucratic, systematic denial of opportunity.
Okay.
It's a society looking at a war hero with a degree and deciding that his race permanently overrides his achievements. It is the administrative process of systematically stripping away a person's humanity and potential over an entire lifetime.
Linstroth connects this deeply to Ralph Ellison's classic novel, Invisible Man. Ellison wrote, "I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination."
That quote is so powerful.
It is. Linstroth argues that this captures the absolute essence of structural violence. The structures are designed to keep people not just oppressed, but entirely invisible to the broader society that benefits from that oppression. But wait, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener.
Sure.
You're painting a picture of a society where the violence is so deeply embedded into the architecture that it's almost invisible to the people who aren't directly experiencing it, like that plantation guide or that teacher who thought their views were totally normal.
Right.
If structural violence is that embedded, how do we even begin to dismantle it? Can you really legislate a cure for a societal sickness?
That is the pivotal question of Linstroth's essay, and he answers it by analyzing the cyclical nature of our societal boiling points. He compared the massive civil unrest we saw in the summer of 2020 directly to the riots that erupted across American cities like New York and Detroit in 1967 and 1968.
Same patterns.
Exactly. He points out a grim reality. The physical and social landscapes of those urban metropolises remain largely unaltered today. The exact same structural conditions are still firmly in place.
Like chronic unemployment, underfunded educational systems, and fraught police relations.
Precisely, they are still unaltered.
He leans heavily on the philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to explain this cycle. He quotes King's famous 1957 sermon, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that."
But he balances that idealistic vision, right?
Yeah, with a stark warning King delivered later, where he stated that a riot is the language of the unheard. King challenged the public to ask, what is it that America has failed to hear?
And Linstroth argues that America has consistently failed to hear that racism itself is the core issue, rather than the reaction to it.
Right.
To highlight this, he quotes the journalist Wesley Lowery, who observed how some critics of the 2020 protests attempted to flip the narrative.
By blaming the activists.
Yes. Lowery noted a popular comfortable fallacy where racism isn't blamed for the unrest. Instead, the people fighting the racism are blamed for disrupting the peace.
Right. There is this myth that if activists just stopped talking about race, America would magically return to a state of racial harmony.
Which is absurd. Lowery points out the absurdity of this, asking anyone to point to the specific era in history where the supposed racial harmony actually existed for minority communities.
Because the foundation was always tilted. So Linstroth calls for a massive legislative sea change. He argues that tweaking the edges, like limiting police chokeholds or establishing misconduct registries, is entirely insufficient for a structural problem.
He advocates for something akin to President Lyndon B. Johnson's sweeping legislation in the 1960s. LBJ launched the War on Poverty. Linstroth says we need a literal, fully funded war on racism.
Okay, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Linstroth's broader background as a global peace researcher becomes the crucial lens.
Oh, absolutely.
He isn't just diagnosing an American problem, he is applying a globally tested conflict resolution framework to it.
Because if you examine his peace portfolio, you find a scholar who has spent years studying deeply entrenched, seemingly intractable conflicts around the world.
Like his work with the Basque conflict in Spain, that's a perfect example. This was a brutal separatist movement that spanned from 1959 all the way to 2010.
And it's vital to note his methodology here. Linstroth fiercely advocates for the victims of the conflict, including Basque supporters who were tortured or disappeared by the Spanish state under the Franco dictatorship.
But he rejects the terrorism.
Completely. He explicitly and totally rejects the violence carried out by ETA, the Basque separatist group. He is firmly rooted in the empirical belief that violence only breeds more structural violence. He actually signed the Brussels Declaration for Basque Peace in 2010.
Hold on. So if he rejects violent revolution, and he knows that just passing a few minor laws won't fix a tilted foundation, what is his actual mechanism for lasting peace?
Mm-hmm.
How do you negotiate with invisible violence?
He champions a very specific sociological tool, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
The Truth Commissions.
Right. He points to how these commissions were effectively utilized in Northern Ireland after the Troubles, in South Africa post-apartheid, and in Guatemala.
Yeah.
He believes these formal commissions are the only viable path forward for deeply intractable societal conflicts. And he specifically advocates for their implementation in America.
So what does this all mean? Whether you are managing a fractured team at work or looking at divided communities, you can't just mandate harmony. You need a structured, safe way to acknowledge past wrongs first, much like those Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Exactly. It is much more than just talking. It is about establishing a permanent, undeniable historical record.
But wait, you're saying a public hearing is going to fix centuries of systemic racism. That sounds incredibly naive, almost entirely symbolic. How does talking actually dismantle structural violence? What is the actual mechanism there?
Well, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not a criminal trial designed to throw people in prison. It is a formal, state-sponsored mechanism designed to make the invisible visible.
Make the invisible visible, yeah.
In South Africa, for example, perpetrators of violence under apartheid were offered a chance at amnesty, but only if they provided full public disclosure of their crimes.
So it trades punishment for absolute truth.
Precisely. It forces the broader society, the people who have been comfortably ignoring the structural violence, to sit in that darkened kitchen with the Tuskegee Airmen and truly undeniably listen.
Wow.
It strips away the ability of a society to live in denial. Linstroth is suggesting that until America undergoes a formal, structural process of acknowledging its complete history of racial violence and systemic oppression on a national stage, the cycle of boiling points and riots will inevitably continue.
Because you can't fix the foundation of the house if half the family refuses to acknowledge that the cracks are even there.
Exactly. To synthesize Linstroth's overarching argument, recognizing the mechanics of structural violence, understanding exactly how the economic engine of historical slavery morphed into modern legal and social disparities is the mandatory first step.
The first step toward healing.
Right. Only through understanding and publicly acknowledging those deep, uncomfortable roots can a society even begin the kind of structured, globally tested peace building that he advocates for.
So why does this matter for you listening to this today? Whether you are trying to catch up on sociology, prepping for a debate, or just trying to make sense of the daily news cycle, having this specific vocabulary gives you a brand new lens.
It really does.
Understanding a term like structural violence helps you see that isolated, tragic incidents on the evening news are rarely actually isolated. They're connected to a long, deliberate historical chain.
It allows you to see the underlying architecture of a society rather than just reacting to the events happening inside of it.
It changes how you process information. But it also leaves us with a massive challenge. And this is the thought we want to leave you with today.
The big question.
Yeah. Dr. Linstroth advocates for Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to heal deeply rooted societal trauma. But for a Truth Commission to actually work, to achieve that healing, both sides of a conflict have to eventually agree on a shared reality of the past.
There has to be an agreed-upon truth before there can ever be reconciliation.
Right. But in our modern era of incredibly polarized media, where even basic documented historical facts are fiercely debated and algorithmically distorted, how does a society ever establish that shared truth to begin the healing?
That's the real hurdle.
If we can't even agree on what the foundation looks like, how do we ever agree on how to fix the house? Something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.